The accidental arrival of Portuguese mariners on the island of Tanegashima in 1543 established the first sustained maritime contact between the European Atlantic powers and the Japanese archipelago. This event originated from a Chinese junk veering off course during a storm carrying 3 Portuguese traders who possessed a technological asset that would fundamentally reorder the military hierarchy of the region. The specific instrument of this transformation was the matchlock musket, a smooth-bore firearm that operated via a slow-burning cord to ignite gunpowder. While the Japanese were familiar with primitive gunpowder weapons through previous continental interactions, the European design offered a superior mechanism for aiming and firing that was previously absent in local warfare. The local lord, Tanegashima Tokitaka, immediately recognized the strategic utility of these weapons and purchased 2 pieces from the sailors for a substantial sum. Beyond the mere acquisition of the hardware, Tokitaka commissioned his chief swordsmith to reverse engineer the European design, a task that required mastering the complex art of threading a screw to seal the barrel's breech. The subsequent domestic production of these firearms progressed with unparalleled speed, as regional lords realized that a peasant infantry equipped with muskets could effectively neutralize the traditional cavalry charges of the elite warrior class. This shift prioritized industrial output and mass recruitment over individual martial skill, facilitating the gradual centralization of power by those commanders who could afford large-scale procurement. The economic infrastructure of this interaction was built upon the disparity between the mercantilist interests of the Portuguese and the resource requirements of the warring Japanese states. The Portuguese functioned as high-capacity intermediaries in a regional trade network where direct commerce between China and Japan was officially prohibited by the Ming Dynasty. By utilizing their deep-draft vessels, the Europeans transported vast quantities of Chinese raw silk into Japanese ports in exchange for locally mined silver, which was then in high demand across the Asian continent. This commercial loop provided the Portuguese with the liquid capital necessary to sustain their colonial outposts in India and Southeast Asia, while granting Japanese authorities access to a consistent supply of foreign goods and weaponry. The arrival of these traders transformed the port of Nagasaki from a small fishing village into a primary international terminal, regulated by official permits and subject to the fiscal oversight of the centralizing military government. This period of intense exchange initiated a demographic and technical integration that made the presence of European agents a permanent, albeit supervised, fixture of the 16th century Japanese political economy. The formal introduction of Roman Catholic proselytization began in 1549 with the arrival of the Society of Jesus, led by the Spanish cleric Francis Xavier. This religious expansion was not a decentralized effort, but a highly disciplined operation, authorized by the Portuguese crown under the framework of royal patronage, which granted the monarchy control over ecclesiastical appointments in newly contacted territories. Upon landing in Kagoshima, Xavier and his companions utilized the assistance of a Japanese convert who had previously fled to Portuguese Malacca, enabling the immediate translation of core theological concepts. However, the mission quickly realized that the decentralized political structure of the Sengoku period necessitated a specific institutional strategy. Unlike missions in other regions that targeted the general populace, the Jesuits in Japan prioritized the conversion of the regional military governors and territorial lords to secure legal protection and official permits for their activities. This top-down methodology was predicated on the feudal principle of total administrative control, where the religious affiliation of a lord often dictated the formal observance of his subordinates. By focusing their intellectual and material resources on the ruling elite, the Jesuits obtained exclusive rights to establish religious infrastructure and schools within specific domains. The order functioned as more than a spiritual entity. It acted as a vital diplomatic and technical bridge for local lords who sought to bypass their rivals in accessing the lucrative European trade. Jesuit advisors frequently served as intermediaries in commercial negotiations, leveraging their linguistic skills and their influence over Portuguese ship captains to prioritize ports controlled by Christian-friendly administrations. This transactional relationship ensured that the propagation of the new faith was inextricably linked to the acquisition of foreign capital and advanced military technology. To facilitate integration, the Jesuit leadership implemented a policy of cultural adaptation, instructing missionaries to adopt local dietary habits, dress, and social etiquette to minimize friction with the traditional establishment. This approach allowed the order to infiltrate the highest levels of the warrior class, where they provided instruction in Western mathematics, cartography, and medicine, alongside their theological curriculum. Despite early success, this strategy created an inherent political risk, as it positioned the Christian community as a distinct interest group within the volatile landscape of internal power struggles. The reliance on the personal favor of regional lords meant that the legal standing of the faith was perpetually conditional and subject to the shifting alliances of the military unifiers. By the mid-16th century, the Jesuit mission had established a robust network of urban centers and educational facilities, transforming the presence of the Roman Church into a sophisticated and influential component of the Japanese political and social order. The proliferation of the new faith reached a critical institutional milestone through the conversion of regional lords, who leveraged their territorial authority to establish permanent religious enclaves. The most significant example of this political realignment was the conversion of Omura Sumatada, the first military governor to formally adopt the foreign religion in 1563. Sumitada's decision was dictated by a precarious domestic position, as his domain faced existential threats from rival neighboring clans. By aligning with a European interest, he secured a reliable supply of advanced weaponry and reinforced his defensive capabilities through the maritime support of the Portuguese fleet. This relationship culminated in 1580 with a strategic donation of the port of Nagasaki and the surrounding district of Mogi to the Society of Jesus. This transfer of administrative and judicial sovereignty transformed a small coastal settlement into a semi-autonomous ecclesiastical territory, effectively governed by religious officials rather than local feudal administrators. This administrative arrangement granted the religious order the authority to collect harbor fees, regulate local commerce, and enforce legal codes within the port's jurisdiction. For the central military authorities, the cession of Nagasaki represented an unprecedented challenge to the traditional concept of unified territorial integrity. The port became a sanctuary for thousands of converts who sought relief from the shifting loyalties of secular lords, creating a dense urban concentration of the religious minority. The order utilized the revenues generated from maritime duties to fund the construction of massive religious edifices, educational academies, and hospitals, which functioned as the physical infrastructure of a developing Christian society. This financial independence allowed the mission to operate without total reliance on the fluctuating patronage of the warrior class, establishing a level of institutional permanence that alarmed the emerging national unifiers. The success of the Nagasaki enclave encouraged other regional leaders to seek similar arrangements, leading to a network of Christian-aligned territories across the southern islands. These lords frequently enforced the destruction of traditional temples and the removal of local shrines within their borders to demonstrate their commitment to the new orthodoxy. However, this aggressive local policy deepened the cultural and political schism between the southern regions and the centralizing government in the north. The presence of a port city under foreign judicial control, sustained by an independent revenue stream and protected by a militarized convert population, provided a tangible justification for the later shogunal arguments regarding the subversive nature of the sect. By the late 16th century, the consolidation of Nagasaki as a religious and commercial hub had made the Christian interest a distinct political entity, possessing the fiscal and geographic autonomy required to resist the absolute claims of the nascent military state. The sustained presence of European religious and commercial agents during the late 16th century was fundamentally underpinned by a specialized fiscal dependency known as the silk for silver exchange. This economic cycle addressed a structural deficiency in regional commerce, as the Chinese government had implemented a strict maritime ban on direct trade with the Japanese islands in response to persistent coastal piracy. Consequently, a massive commercial vacuum emerged, which the European intermediaries occupied by utilizing their advanced maritime logistics to ferry high-demand commodities between the two Asian powers. The primary article of this trade was raw Chinese silk, which was essential for the textile industries of the Japanese aristocracy, yet could only be procured through these foreign third-party carriers who possessed the necessary deep-sea vessels and diplomatic reach. The Japanese contribution to this nexus was the provision of vast quantities of refined silver, derived from the rapid expansion of domestic mining operations in provinces like Iwami. During this era, Japan emerged as one of the world's leading producers of bullion, a resource that the European traders required to balance their books in the Chinese markets, where silver was the primary medium for tax payments and large-scale transactions. This symbiotic relationship granted the foreign merchants a position of extreme leverage. The annual arrival of the large cargo vessels from the southern colonies was the single most important event in the Japanese fiscal calendar. The military government tolerated the proselytization efforts of the religious missions, primarily because they functioned as the essential administrative guarantors of this commerce. Shogunal officials understood that the merchant fleets were closely aligned with the religious orders, and any premature move to banish the priests could result in a total cessation of the silk supply and a catastrophic loss of customs revenue. Furthermore, the European presence introduced sophisticated credit mechanisms and insurance practices that were previously unknown in local markets. The religious missions often functioned as informal banking institutions, managing large sums of capital for regional lords and facilitating the secure transfer of funds across different island territories. This integration into the domestic financial architecture made the cost of expulsion prohibitive for many decades. The central authorities were effectively trapped in a cycle of calculated tolerance, where the perceived spiritual threat of the foreign faith was outweighed by the tangible material benefits of the maritime trade. This nexus remained stable as long as no other power could provide a viable alternative to the specific logistical services offered by the Southern Europeans. It was only the eventual arrival of competing northern maritime powers, who offered purely commercial terms without religious objectives, that allowed the Japanese state to begin the process of decoupling its economy from the influence of the missions. The intellectual and artistic interface between the European missions and the Japanese elite produced a unique body of cultural output that extended beyond religious conversion. This interaction was facilitated by the introduction of the movable type printing press by the religious orders, which allowed for the first systematic production of books using Western typographical methods in the archipelago. This technology was utilized to compile comprehensive linguistic tools, including the first dictionaries and grammars that reconciled the phonetics of the Japanese language with the Latin alphabet. These scholarly works were essential for the training of native clergy and foreign administrators, providing a standardized medium for communication that transcended regional dialects. Furthermore, the translation movement encompassed a diverse range of secular subjects, including European works on astronomy, anatomy, and surgical techniques, which introduced empirical scientific observations to the local intellectual class. In the realm of visual culture, the presence of foreign agents stimulated the development of a distinct artistic style characterized by the application of Western perspective and oil painting techniques to traditional media. Local artisans, trained in academies established by the missions, began to produce complex screen paintings that documented the arrival of foreign vessels and the specific attire and customs of the visitors. These works functioned as both decorative assets and historical records, reflecting a profound curiosity about the external world among the military aristocracy. The exchange also influenced the decorative arts, as Japanese craftsmen adapted their traditional lacquerware techniques to create liturgical objects and portable furniture designed for the European market. This export industry provided the religious missions with an additional source of revenue while integrating Japanese aesthetic standards into the burgeoning global trade network. Beyond physical artifacts, the cultural synthesis manifested in the adoption of Western methods of timekeeping and cartography. The introduction of mechanical clocks and sophisticated world maps challenged the traditional geocentric and localized worldview, providing the military unifiers with a more accurate understanding of global geography and maritime navigation. These technical assets were highly valued for their strategic utility, as they allowed for more precise military planning and a clearer assessment of the burgeoning European empires in the Pacific. However, the dissemination of these foreign ideas also introduced a new layer of intellectual competition, as traditionalist scholars and religious authorities viewed the influx of Western rationalism as a threat to the established social and cosmological order. This period of academic and artistic cross-pollination established an intellectual foundation that would eventually be characterized by the shogunate as a subversive influence, necessitating the subsequent policy of total cultural and administrative isolation. The rapid territorial consolidation achieved by the military commander Oda Nobunaga was supported by a strategic patronage of European religious orders, utilized primarily as a geopolitical instrument to erode the traditional influence of militant Buddhist institutions. During the 16th century, several Buddhist sects possessed significant autonomous power, maintaining their own fortified temple complexes and private infantries that frequently challenged the authority of the centralizing military state. Nobunaga recognized that the introduction of a competing theological framework would fracture the religious monopoly held by these domestic adversaries, thereby facilitating his campaign for national unification. By granting the Jesuit mission official permission to build residential facilities and places of worship in the capital of Kyoto and the strategic hub of Azuchi, he effectively introduced an intellectual and social counterweight to the established temples. This relationship was characterized by a strict political calculus rather than any personal inclination toward the foreign faith. Nobunaga exploited the presence of the missions to gain access to global intelligence and superior logistical techniques, while simultaneously providing the clerics with the physical security required to expand their operations into central Japan. This protection allowed the order to establish the first major seminary in Azuchi, where they trained a new generation of Japanese scholars and officials in disciplines that prioritize loyalty to the state over ecclesiastical tradition. The visibility of the foreign mission served as a constant reminder to the Buddhist hierarchy that their historical dominance was no longer guaranteed. Furthermore, the military government utilized the expertise of the foreign advisors in the construction of fortified structures and the development of advanced defensive measures, integrating European engineering principles into the design of Nobunaga's monumental castle projects. The political utility of the faith reached its height during the protracted military campaigns against the various leagues of armed monks and rebellious religious peasants. While Nobunaga systematically dismantled the physical infrastructure of the militant Buddhist orders, he concurrently encouraged the growth of the Christian minority as a loyalist faction that remained entirely dependent on his personal protection. This policy of selective toleration ensured that the Christian community remained a specialized demographic that served the interests of the unifier without possessing the independent landed power that had made the Buddhist sects so dangerous. However, this period of favorable treatment established a precarious precedent, as the legal standing of the faith became inextricably tied to the survival and personal will of a single military leader. The sudden assassination of Nobunaga in 1582 created an immediate power vacuum, leaving the mission exposed to the more suspicious and xenophobic tendencies of his successors, who viewed the same foreign influence as a potential threat to their own newly established stability. The completion of the military campaign in the southern islands in 1587 provided the new supreme commander, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, with a direct assessment of the institutional strength of the foreign faith. During his inspection of the occupied territories, he observed that the religious order not only held administrative jurisdiction over a primary international port, but also exerted a level of social control that superseded local civil authority. This discovery fundamentally altered the state's perspective, shifting the perception of the religious missions from useful technical assets to a primary threat to national sovereignty. Hideyoshi realized that the convert's primary allegiance to an external religious hierarchy created a destabilizing element within his newly unified political structure. The ability of the religious leadership to mobilize large populations across different regional boundaries suggested the existence of a parallel government that could potentially collaborate with external imperial powers. 3 specific factors triggered the immediate legal pushback against the missions. First, the authorities received reports of the forced removal of indigenous shrines and the destruction of traditional temples by zealous converts, which was viewed as a direct assault on the traditional social order that underpinned the commander's legitimacy. Second, the discovery of the illicit trade in human beings, specifically the purchase and export of Japanese subjects as laborers to European colonies, outraged the central administration, which viewed the populace as the exclusive property of the state. Third, the military government became increasingly suspicious of the massive fortifications and stockpiles of munitions maintained within the religious enclaves, which indicated a capacity for sustained military resistance against the central authority. These findings led to the issuance of a formal decree in the summer of 1587, which marked the first comprehensive state-level restriction on the foreign faith. The 1587 decree mandated the immediate departure of all foreign clerics from the islands within 20 days, signaling an end to the era of unrestricted patronage. However, the document included a critical pragmatic distinction that separated religious proselytization from international commerce. While the priests were ordered to vacate, the European merchant fleet was explicitly permitted to remain and continue its operations, provided they refrained from religious activities. This policy demonstrated the state's ongoing attempt to decouple the essential silk trade from the perceived spiritual contamination of the mission. Although the decree was not immediately enforced with total rigor due to the lack of a suitable replacement for European maritime services, it established a permanent legal precedent. It formally classified the foreign religion as a subversive element and provided the bureaucratic framework that subsequent administrations would use to execute a more absolute and final removal of all non-conforming residents. The grounding of the Spanish galleon San Felipe on the coast of Shikoku in 1596 served as a pivotal intelligence event that confirmed the Japanese administration's deepest anxieties regarding European colonial ambitions. This vessel, transporting a massive cargo of silk and gold from the Philippines to the Americas, was forced into a provincial port following a series of severe storms. Under the prevailing maritime laws of the era, the local authorities claimed the right to seize the ship's contents as salvage for the state treasury. During the subsequent interrogation of the crew, a senior pilot allegedly attempted to intimidate the Japanese officials by displaying a map of the expansive Spanish global empire. When questioned about the methods utilized to acquire such vast territories, the pilot purportedly explained that the monarchy first dispatched religious missionaries to convert the local populace, thereby creating an internal faction of loyalists who would eventually facilitate the entry of a conquering military force. Whether this statement was a literal boast or a translation error, the report reached the Supreme Commander with immediate and devastating effect. It provided a coherent narrative that linked the presence of the religious orders to the broader strategic goals of the Spanish and Portuguese crowns. The military government interpreted the activities of the friars not as an independent spiritual mission, but as the initial phase of a coordinated intelligence operation designed to undermine the psychological and political defenses of the nation. This incident also exposed the logistical vulnerability of the archipelago, as it demonstrated that Spanish territories in the Pacific were within striking distance of the Japanese coast. The administration concluded that the internal religious schism created by decades of proselytization had established a vulnerable opening for foreign intervention. The immediate political consequence was a sharp escalation in the enforcement of previously dormant anti-Christian legislation. The central government used the testimony from the shipwreck to justify a systematic crackdown on the Franciscan order, which had been operating in the capital under the guise of diplomatic immunity. This shift in policy moved beyond the administrative restrictions of the previous decade and entered the realm of active state-sponsored violence. The authorities ordered the arrest of prominent religious leaders and their primary Japanese supporters, signaling that the state no longer viewed the Christian community as a protected commercial asset. Furthermore, the incident intensified the internal rivalries between the different European factions, as the resident religious missions attempted to distance themselves from the pilot's inflammatory claims. By late 1596, the diplomatic blunder of the San Felipe had provided the Japanese state with the necessary evidence to redefine the foreign faith as an existential military threat, setting the stage for the first large-scale public executions of the religious minority. Following the intelligence gathered from the shipwrecked vessel, the military administration implemented a definitive and public display of state power to verify that its previous administrative decrees were no longer mere suggestions. In early 1597, the Central Authority ordered the apprehension of 26 individuals, a group that deliberately included both foreign clerics and native converts of varying social standing. This selection served a specific bureaucratic purpose. It demonstrated that the state considered adherence to the foreign faith a collective liability that transcended both national origin and domestic rank. The prisoners were subjected to a state-mandated journey of approximately 1,000 kilometers from the administrative center in the heart of the country to the primary southern port. This logistical maneuver was designed as a mobile psychological operation, exposing the captives to the populace across numerous provinces to illustrate the consequences of ideological defiance. The final destination for the execution was a hill overlooking the southern port city that had previously functioned as an autonomous religious enclave. The choice of this specific site was highly symbolic, intended to signal that the central government had reasserted its judicial and physical sovereignty over the very territories that the missions had claimed as their own. The method of execution utilized traditional forms of capital punishment involving the public display of the victims on wooden frames, where they were subsequently dispatched by state executioners, utilizing spears. This ritualized violence was not an act of spontaneous religious persecution, but a calculated administrative performance intended to prioritize the absolute authority of the supreme commander over any competing spiritual allegiance. By targeting children and elderly lay people alongside the foreign priests, the state articulated a policy of total intolerance for the survival of the sect within the emerging national order. The physical remains were left on display for several months, serving as a persistent visual deterrent to the residents of the port and the surrounding territories. This event marked the first instance where the central government utilized its professional military apparatus to systematically liquidate a religious minority, transitioning the state's response from legal restriction to active extermination. It also established a precedent for the use of public spectacle as a tool for enforcing religious homogeneity and political loyalty. The execution successfully dismantled the perception of immunity that had previously protected the religious missions due to their commercial utility. Although the maritime trade continued, the state had definitively proven that its monopoly on violence was superior to the intellectual and material assets provided by the foreign agents. This act of state-sponsored terror finalized the shift toward the era of total prohibition, establishing the blueprint for the more comprehensive administrative and military actions that would characterize the 17th century state. The monolithic control of the initial religious mission was permanently compromised by the entry of competing clerical organizations from the Spanish colonies in the late 16th century. This expansion was not merely a theological development, but a direct consequence of the global geopolitical rivalry between the Spanish and Portuguese crowns for administrative and spiritual supremacy in the Pacific. These newcomer groups, primarily consisting of mendicant orders, challenged the long-standing exclusivity of the first mission, which had operated under a specific framework of maritime patronage. The resulting institutional friction created a profound internal schism, as the various clerical factions utilized their respective diplomatic connections to undermine the legitimacy and influence of their rivals within the Japanese political system. The strategic methodologies of these new arrivals differed fundamentally from the established top-down approach of their predecessors. While the earlier mission had prioritized the conversion of the military elite and maintained a policy of cultural adaptation to minimize social friction, the mendicant groups engaged in highly visible public proselytization among the urban poor and the merchant classes. They frequently rejected the established protocols of accommodation, opting instead for open-air preaching and the construction of conspicuous charitable facilities that operated without the explicit authorization of the central military government. This overt defiance of existing restrictive edicts was viewed by the administration as a deliberate provocation intended to test the limits of state authority. The central leadership noted that the foreign clerical community was unable to maintain a unified front, as the competing factions issued conflicting petitions and provided contradictory intelligence to officials in an effort to secure preferential treatment. For the Japanese state, these internal fractures provided a valuable opportunity to assess the true nature of the foreign presence. The administration exploited these rivalries to identify the underlying political motivations of the missions, concluding that they were effectively serving as ideological extensions of competing European monarchies. The persistent hostility between the different clerical orders convinced the military government that the foreign faith was a fragmented and unstable influence that posed a risk to national security and domestic order. This perception significantly weakened the collective standing of the foreign community, as the state could now manipulate the internal divisions to extract more favorable commercial concessions. By the turn of the 17th century, the visible lack of institutional discipline and the escalating competition for converts had provided the shogunate with a comprehensive justification for implementing more rigorous and standardized prohibitions. The administrative realization that these various religious groups were fundamentally antagonistic toward one another finalized the transition toward a policy that classified all foreign religious activity as a singular, subversive threat to the unified sovereign state. The establishment of the Tokugawa military government following the decisive Battle of 1600 introduced a period of calculated administrative ambiguity regarding the legal status of the foreign faith. The first supreme commander of this new dynasty, a veteran military strategist, inherited a state where the previous administration's restrictive edicts remained on the books but were largely unenforced. This temporary suspension of active persecution was not a result of ideological tolerance, but was a fundamental requirement for the stabilization of the new regime's finances. The military government prioritized the consolidation of its domestic authority, a process that required a consistent flow of international revenue and the continued extraction of precious metals. The commander recognized that the immediate and total removal of the foreign religious missions would disrupt the maritime logistics upon which the national economy relied, potentially alienating the European merchant fleets before a viable alternative could be established. During the first decade of the 17th century, the central administration adopted a policy of pragmatic non-interference, allowing the religious missions to rebuild their infrastructure in the southern ports and even expand their activities into the central provinces. The military government went as far as to utilize converted officials and foreign religious advisors within the highest levels of the civil service, valuing their expertise in maritime law, international diplomacy, and the management of refined metal exports. These individuals functioned as essential conduits between the shogunate and the colonial administrations in Southeast Asia, ensuring that the new government's silver output reached global markets. The commander personally engaged in diplomatic correspondence with the Spanish governors in the Philippines, seeking to invite additional merchant vessels while simultaneously ignoring the religious nature of their accompanying passengers. This calculated neglect allowed the government to rebuild its treasury after years of internal warfare, utilizing the capital generated by the foreign missions to solidify its control over the various territorial lords. However, this period of relative stability was characterized by a profound underlying skepticism. While the state tolerated the physical presence of the clerics, it continued to monitor the growth of the convert population with extreme scrutiny, viewing the increasing numbers as a potential obstacle to the total centralization of judicial power. The military government utilized this interval to study the internal politics of the European powers, seeking to identify the specific economic motivations that drove their maritime expansion. This intelligence gathering allowed the administration to identify the inherent weaknesses in the Portuguese and Spanish trade monopoly, laying the groundwork for a future economic system that would not require the presence of foreign religious agents. The initial toleration was therefore a strategic maneuver designed to maximize short-term fiscal gain, while the state developed the administrative machinery necessary for long-term isolation. By 1610, the shogunate had successfully utilized the foreign religious and commercial nexus to stabilize its new political order, making the missions increasingly redundant as the state's internal grip on the regional lords became absolute. The arrival of the Dutch vessel Liefde on the coast of Kyushu in April 1600 introduced a decisive shift in the Japanese administration's understanding of European geopolitics and maritime technology. This ship, the sole remnant of a failed commercial expedition, carried a small number of survivors, including the English pilot William Adams and the Dutch navigator Jan Houston. Their entry into the archipelago coincided with the final stages of the military unification, providing the Supreme Commander with a new source of technical intelligence that was independent of the established religious missions. Upon their arrival, the Jesuit clerics in the region actively campaigned for the immediate execution of the survivors, classifying them as maritime outlaws and heretics. However, the military government chose to protect the sailors, recognizing that their specialized knowledge of artillery, navigation, and world geography represented a significant asset for a nascent dynasty seeking to solidify its internal and external authority. William Adams was eventually elevated to a prominent administrative position, serving as a trusted advisor to the Supreme Commander on matters of international law and maritime engineering. Through his instruction, the central government initiated its first domestic program for the construction of ocean-going vessels built according to European design principles, which allowed the state to project its influence across the Western Pacific without total reliance on foreign shipping. Adams and his Dutch counterparts provided the Japanese leadership with the first comprehensive explanation of the religious schism in Europe, detailing the conflict between the Protestant northern nations and the Catholic monarchies of Spain and Portugal. This information was critical for the state's long-term planning, as it demonstrated that the Southern European monopoly on international commerce could be challenged. The military government realized that the Dutch and English offered a purely secular trade model that prioritized the exchange of manufactured goods and bullion over the propagation of a foreign faith. The presence of these northern advisors allowed the military government to decouple its economic security from the influence of the religious orders. By securing direct access to European maritime techniques and logistical expertise, the central administration began to view the Catholic missions as an unnecessary political liability rather than an essential commercial bridge. This intellectual independence empowered the government to impose more stringent regulations on the religious community, confident that the essential supply of foreign materials could be maintained through these new, non-proselytizing channels. The arrival of the Liefde thus finalized the transition from a period of forced dependency on the Catholic missions to an era of state-controlled international relations. It established the administrative and technical foundations for the later isolationist decrees, as the government now possessed the maritime capacity and political intelligence to manage its borders on its own terms. The formalization of diplomatic and commercial relations with the Northern European powers provided the central government with the evidence required to dismantle the long-standing maritime monopoly of the Catholic missions. In 1609, the military administration authorized the establishment of a permanent commercial facility for a Dutch corporate entity in the port of Hirado, marking the first time the state engaged with a European power that explicitly disavowed religious proselytization. This new partnership offered a starkly different operational model than the earlier Southern European missions, as these northern agents functioned as representatives of a profit-oriented organization rather than a sovereign religious hierarchy. The Supreme Commander recognized that these northern merchants possessed the same deep-sea logistical capabilities as the Portuguese, but operated without the secondary objective of converting the domestic population to a foreign faith. This realization fundamentally altered the government's risk-reward calculation concerning international trade. Previous administrations had tolerated the presence of religious clerics as an unavoidable cost for securing essential materials like silk and lead, but the Dutch presence proved that the maritime supply chain could be maintained through purely secular channels. These northern traders actively assisted the state in this transition by providing detailed intelligence on the colonial activities of the Spanish and Portuguese crowns, reinforcing the narrative that the Catholic orders were precursors to territorial annexation. By securing competitive bids for foreign goods from these new partners, the central government undermined the economic leverage previously held by the southern European captains. This competitive environment allowed the state to dictate increasingly stringent terms of entry, eventually leading to the total separation of religious affairs from commercial logistics. The military government utilized this new economic independence to conduct a series of audits on the southern European trade, gradually stripping away the privileges that had protected the religious missions for decades. The administration concluded that the northern European merchants offered a stable, predictable, and non-subversive alternative for the acquisition of global resources. This decoupling of trade from religion removed the final barrier to the comprehensive enforcement of anti-Christian legislation. The government could now proceed with the systematic removal of the foreign priests without fearing a total collapse of the customs revenue or a shortage of essential imports. By the early 17th century, the shogunate had successfully reconfigured the national economy to function around these secular maritime partnerships, making the spiritual and administrative influence of the Catholic orders entirely redundant. This strategic realignment provided the fiscal security necessary for the state to prioritize ideological purity over commercial convenience, finalizing the path toward a religiously homogeneous and politically isolated realm. The legal and political stability of the new military dynasty was severely tested in 1612 by a domestic corruption scandal that originated within the central administration's own ranks. This event involved a high-level secretary named Okamoto Daihachi and a regional military governor from the southern islands, Arima Harunobu. The core of the controversy centered on an illicit attempt to regain ancestral territories that had been seized by the government during previous military campaigns. Arima, seeking to restore his clan's former influence, provided substantial monetary bribes to Okamoto, who occupied a strategic position as a subordinate to one of the Supreme Commander's primary ministers. Okamoto falsely represented that the central government would authorize the return of these lands in exchange for the payments, a claim that bypassed the official bureaucratic channels of the state. When the promised land grants failed to materialize, Arima initiated an official complaint, which triggered a comprehensive judicial inquiry by the military leadership. The investigation revealed not only a sophisticated financial fraud, but also a clandestine network of communication between officials who shared the same foreign religious affiliation. For the Supreme Commander, the primary concern was not the financial nature of the bribery, but the discovery that high-ranking members of the administration were utilizing their shared faith to coordinate activities that were hidden from the sovereign. This revelation confirmed the government's long-standing suspicion that the religious minority functioned as a subversive interest group, or a fifth column, that placed its internal communal loyalties above the absolute requirements of state service. The administration concluded that the foreign faith provided a secondary, competing hierarchy that could be utilized to manipulate government policy and destabilize the centralizing authority. The judicial response was absolute and designed to serve as a definitive public warning. Okamoto was sentenced to death by burning, a severe penalty reserved for acts of high treason and subversion against the state. Arima was stripped of his territorial titles and eventually executed, effectively dissolving the administrative power of his clan. This scandal marked the terminal point of the era of high-level toleration for converted officials within the central bureaucracy. The military government immediately implemented a comprehensive purge of all individuals associated with the foreign faith from the civil and military administration. This incident transformed the state's perception of the religious minority from a commercial and technical resource into an internal security threat, that required immediate and total eradication. The Okamoto Daihachi incident provided the necessary domestic evidence for the Supreme Commander to transition from regional restrictions to a nationwide policy of absolute prohibition. The military government's anxiety regarding the foreign faith was significantly magnified by its growing comprehension of the centralized political hierarchy of the Roman Church and the sovereign status of its supreme leader. This understanding was refined through the return of a publicized diplomatic mission in 1590, which had spent years traveling to the Italian peninsula to seek an audience with the religious head of the southern European powers. The reports from this embassy provided the Japanese administration with evidence of a foreign jurisdictional claim that was fundamentally incompatible with the absolute authority of the Supreme Commander. The government realized that the religious hierarchy was a political entity exercising a form of international governance that demanded the primary obedience of its adherents regardless of their domestic national loyalty. The administration's intelligence network identified a theological doctrine prevalent in the southern European kingdoms, asserting that the supreme religious leader possessed the legal authority to depose secular monarchs who failed to align with ecclesiastical interests. For a military state centralizing power, this concept of a superior external jurisdiction represented an existential risk. The Supreme Commander concluded that the foreign faith sought to establish a state within a state, where the domestic population would view the dictates of a distant sovereign as superior to the laws of their own government. This perception was reinforced by the observation that the religious missions maintained their own judicial protocols and reported directly to their headquarters, bypassing the established legal channels of the central authority. Furthermore, the state became increasingly wary of the specific oaths of loyalty required by the religious orders, which emphasized a spiritual bond transcending the traditional relationship between a lord and his retainers. The military leadership argued that the foreign faith aimed to dismantle the indigenous social contract by introducing a universalist ideology that prioritized the directives of the overseas religious center. By the early 17th century, the central administration had classified the foreign religious head as a competing sovereign who posed a direct challenge to the monopoly on political and social order. The fear of this connection was based on the pragmatic assessment that a population under the command of an external leader could never be fully integrated into a loyal national body. This realization finalized the administrative shift toward the complete removal of the missions, as the state determined that national sovereignty required the absolute severance of all links to the religious headquarters of the Western world. In 1612, the military government initiated a calculated phase of localized legal testing to determine the administrative feasibility of a total religious prohibition. This preliminary enforcement was strictly confined to the territories under the direct jurisdictional control of the Supreme Commander and his retired predecessor, serving as a controlled environment to assess the institutional response of the elite warrior class. By limiting the initial decrees to these specific urban centers and strategic districts, the administration sought to evaluate the bureaucratic mechanisms required to identify, categorize, and potentially remove non-conforming subjects without triggering a wider regional rebellion. The primary objective was to verify the absolute personal loyalty of the central military staff and the high-ranking retainers who managed the core functions of the nascent state. The 1612 prohibitions mandated that all individuals within the central administration formally renounce their affiliation with the proscribed sect and provide verifiable proof of their return to traditional domestic religious practices. This requirement was enforced through the submission of signed oaths and the mandatory registration of households with government-approved temples, establishing a systematic method of ideological verification. Those who refused to comply were not merely subjected to social ostracization, but were immediately stripped of their official ranks, confiscated of their hereditary lands, and exiled from the administrative capitals. This purge of the inner circle served as a definitive test of the government's ability to dismantle religious influence within its own specialized military and civil service. The authorities utilized these early actions to refine the processes of asset seizure and the public destruction of religious infrastructure, ensuring that the removal of the faith's physical presence was executed with maximum administrative efficiency. The success of these localized measures provided the central leadership with the empirical data necessary to expand the prohibition to a national scale. The government observed that while several high-ranking retainers chose exile over recantation, the overall structure of the military administration remained stable and unaffected by the removal of these specialized agents. This finding validated the state's earlier conclusion that the religious minority was an expendable demographic that could be excised without compromising the essential functions of the government. Furthermore, the 1612 actions allowed the central leadership to identify the specific geographic pockets of resistance and the underground networks utilized by the foreign clerics to maintain contact with their adherents. By late 1613, the lessons derived from these regional pilot programs had been codified into a standardized set of procedures for a nationwide expulsion. This period of focused legal testing transitioned the state's anti-religious policy from a series of reactive measures to a proactive, comprehensive strategy for the total ideological purification of the realm. The execution of the prominent Southern military governor following the 1612 corruption scandal triggered a profound breakdown in the social and political order of the Arima Peninsula. While the central government had successfully purged the high-ranking officials within the capital, the implementation of anti-religious edicts in the southern territories met with a different and more volatile form of resistance. The successor to the Arima clan, though compliant with the state's demand to renounce the foreign faith, faced an immediate and organized revolt from his own hereditary retainers and the local agrarian population. This unrest was not a traditional territorial dispute, but a coordinated military insurrection driven by a shared religious identity that bypassed the conventional bonds of feudal loyalty. For the central administration, this localized rebellion confirmed the persistent anxiety that the foreign faith could serve as a primary catalyst for domestic instability and armed resistance. The insurgents utilized their technical familiarity with European-style fortifications and defensive tactics, which had been integrated into the regional military architecture during the preceding decades of maritime contact. The rebels occupied strategic high points and utilized stockpiled munitions to repel the initial efforts of the local authorities to enforce the religious prohibitions. The central government observed that these subjects were no longer operating as individual actors, but as a disciplined military body motivated by an ideological framework that made traditional diplomatic settlement impossible. The use of religious icons and symbols on the battlefield served as a visual testament to a competing allegiance that the supreme commander viewed as a direct challenge to his monopoly on domestic power. This confirmed the administrative thesis that the foreign religion functioned as a unifying force capable of mobilizing diverse social classes against the sovereign state. The military government responded by authorizing a massive mobilization of forces from neighboring provinces to suppress the uprising, treating the event as a significant national security crisis rather than a local police action. The subsequent campaign involved the systematic siege of fortified religious enclaves and the widespread liquidation of those who refused to surrender their ideological commitments. This suppression provided the state with a logistical template for the large-scale military operations that would soon be required for a nationwide purge. The administration concluded that the survival of the foreign faith in the southern islands posed a permanent risk of recurring civil war, as the converts possessed both the motivation and the technical means to challenge the centralizing authority. The Arima Rebellion finalized the state's transition from a policy of bureaucratic restriction to one of total military exclusion. It provided the definitive evidence required to convince the remaining neutral lords that the absolute removal of the religious missions was a necessary prerequisite for the long-term survival of the unified military dynasty. The defeat of the opposition forces at the turn of the 17th century served as the primary catalyst for the dismantling of the Christian military elite. One prominent commander and high-ranking administrator represented the apex of this influence within the upper echelons of the previous government. His subsequent execution by the victorious military faction was not merely a penalty for battlefield opposition, but a strategic administrative act designed to eliminate a powerful leader whose religious and political loyalties were inextricably linked. This event signaled to the remaining warrior class that the new central administration would no longer tolerate high-ranking officials who maintained strong ties to the foreign missions. Following this execution, the central government initiated a comprehensive review of the feudal hierarchy to identify and isolate other lords who shared these religious convictions. The administration recognized that these commanders possessed significant martial expertise and controlled strategic territories that could serve as hubs for future insurrection. To mitigate this risk, the government employed a policy of administrative attrition, gradually stripping these lords of their official responsibilities and transferring their hereditary lands to loyalists. This process was executed with bureaucratic precision, utilizing legal pretexts such as minor infractions or failures in local management to justify the confiscation of their titles and assets. By removing these figures from the highest levels of the military council, the state ensured that the religious minority was deprived of its political leadership and its access to the sovereign. The purge extended beyond the territorial lords to the middle and lower tiers of the warrior elite, specifically targeting those who served as administrators and personal retainers within the central court. The government mandated that all members of the professional military class formally declare their rejection of the proscribed faith or face immediate dismissal. This ultimatum forced thousands of skilled officials to choose between their professional standing and their religious identity, effectively purging the civil and military service of all who prioritize spiritual doctrine over state duty. The resulting loss of elite support isolated the remaining foreign missions, as they no longer possessed high-ranking domestic advocates who could intercede on their behalf with the central authority. This systematic removal transformed the demographic profile of the Japanese leadership, creating a religiously homogeneous administration entirely beholden to the new dynasty. The state successfully converted a previously influential political faction into a marginalized group of outcasts, stripping them of their status and economic resources. By 1614, the dismantling of this military elite was virtually complete, ensuring that the upcoming national expulsion would face no significant resistance from within the professional warrior class. This administrative excision finalized the state's monopoly on loyalty and established the internal security necessary for the final decree. The institutionalization of the religious registration system marked the definitive transition of the domestic population into a supervised, state-managed collective. This administrative innovation shifted the primary burden of ideological surveillance from the central military authority to local clerical institutions, effectively converting every temple in the realm into an auxiliary branch of the civil bureaucracy. Under this framework, every household, regardless of social rank or professional status, was legally compelled to affiliate with a specific approved religious establishment. This association was not a voluntary expression of spiritual conviction, but a mandatory civic requirement designed to provide a continuous and verifiable record of a subject's adherence to the permitted traditional order. The resulting documentation functioned as a comprehensive social database, regulating the movement, status, and legal identity of the entire populace. The central mechanism of this oversight was the periodic issuance of formal certificates of religious verification. These documents served as the exclusive evidence that an individual was not a member of the prohibited foreign sect. By requiring these certifications for all significant life events, including the recording of births, the authorization of marriages, and the performance of funerary rites, the state integrated the clerical hierarchy into the most intimate functions of the social contract. An individual unable to produce a valid certificate from their assigned institution was effectively erased from the legal record, losing all rights to property, protection, and legitimate burial. This policy of administrative exclusion ensured that the preservation of a secret religious identity would result in the total collapse of an individual's civil existence and the forfeiture of their familial legacy. Furthermore, the registration system functioned as a high-precision instrument for national demographic management. It enabled the central government to conduct detailed inventories of human resources, track the migration of agricultural laborers, and monitor the shifting density of regional populations. Clerical officials were mandated to maintain exhaustive ledgers that were subject to rigorous inspection by government auditors, ensuring that no unregistered persons were sheltered within the local communities. This level of granular surveillance rendered the long-term survival of clandestine religious groups nearly impossible, as the lack of state-approved documentation would eventually reveal any non-conforming elements. By the early 17th century, the fusion of religious record-keeping with the state's administrative objectives had established a permanent infrastructure for social control. This system finalized the government's monopoly over the public and private identities of its subjects, creating a religiously uniform society where the exclusion of foreign influence was maintained through continuous bureaucratic verification. The final preparatory phase for the nationwide removal involved a rigorous and high-resolution inventory of the non-conforming population across every administrative district. While the previously established registration system provided a general framework for social management, the 1613 survey functioned as a specialized state inquiry designed to identify every remaining adherent of the foreign faith with surgical precision. The central government dispatched specialized commissions of inspectors to work alongside local magistrates and neighborhood elders, tasked with verifying the genealogical and ideological records of every household. This operation moved beyond simple documentation. It required physical appearances and verbal declarations of faith, cross-referenced against the internal ledgers maintained by local authorities and religious institutions. The objective was to create an exhaustive and centralized database that categorized the population into those who had fully recanted and those who remained internally defiant. The methodology of this survey relied heavily on the principle of collective responsibility, where small groups of households were held legally liable for the actions and beliefs of their members. This ensured that the burden of identification was placed on the community itself, forcing neighbors to participate in the state's intelligence-gathering apparatus to avoid shared punishment. Inspectors utilized detailed questionnaires to probe for inconsistencies in family histories, specifically looking for individuals who had relocated from previously Christian-heavy southern regions to the central provinces. This tracking of internal migration was essential for uncovering clandestine networks and preventing the concealment of religious agents within the shifting labor markets of the urban centers. The resulting data provided the Supreme Commander with a clear map of the demographic and geographic distribution of the minority, allowing for the precise allocation of military resources for the upcoming expulsion. Simultaneously, the state conducted a comprehensive inventory of the physical and financial assets associated with the religious community. This included the formal assessment of private residences, agricultural land titles, and stored commodities held by identified converts and foreign organizations. Government auditors meticulously recorded the value of these assets to facilitate their immediate seizure and redistribution once the final decree was issued. The survey also targeted the hidden infrastructure of the faith, identifying private meeting spaces and domestic residences that had been modified to serve as clandestine chapels. By inventorying the total material wealth of the mission and its supporters, the administration ensured that the religious movement would be stripped of its economic capacity for survival. The completion of this national census provided the shogunate with the logistical confidence required to transition from surveillance to action. By late 1613, the state possessed a complete administrative blueprint for the total removal of the foreign presence, marking the conclusion of the preparatory era and the beginning of the final execution of the expulsion policy. In January 1614, the central military government issued a definitive national decree that terminated all remaining legal protections for the foreign faith. This document, signed by the Supreme Commander Hidetada, moved beyond the regional experiments of the previous years to establish a comprehensive and permanent prohibition across the entire archipelago. The edict officially classified the religious missions as a subversive sect and an enemy of the state, arguing that their presence was fundamentally incompatible with a preservation of national sovereignty. The legal text articulated a clear binary between the traditional social order and what it described as a corrupting foreign influence that aimed to dismantle the established hierarchy. By codifying these grievances into a singular national law, the administration provided a standardized judicial framework for the total eradication of the sect. The theological rationale within the decree emphasized that the foreign faith encouraged subjects to prioritize spiritual commands over the absolute directives of the secular government. The state argued that this dual allegiance created a psychological environment where domestic rebellion and treason became inevitable. By defining the faith as a poison to the body politic, the government justified the use of extreme administrative and military measures for its removal. The edict also addressed the geopolitical dimension, asserting that the religious orders were specifically designed to facilitate the territorial expansion of Western empires. This codified the belief that the propagation of the new doctrine was the primary intelligence component of a larger coordinated invasion strategy, making the presence of any foreign cleric an act of military aggression. The 1614 decree mandated the immediate and total cessation of all religious activities, the destruction of every remaining place of worship, and the mandatory registration of every citizen with approved domestic institutions. Unlike previous measures that allowed for commercial exceptions, this law required the physical deportation of every foreign cleric and the most prominent native converts, regardless of their previous service to the state. The administration utilized this document to revoke the commercial privileges of the southern European fleets, signaling that the government was prepared to risk economic disruption to ensure ideological homogeneity. The issuance of the edict transformed the legal standing of the religious minority from a tolerated demographic into a criminalized population subject to state-sponsored liquidation. It provided local magistrates with the absolute judicial authority to use capital punishment to enforce compliance, finalizing the state's monopoly on the spiritual and political life of its subjects. The formal justification for the nationwide banishment was articulated through a complex synthesis of indigenous spiritual traditions and the newly adopted political philosophy of the military state. Central to this theological rationale was the revived concept of the archipelago as a sacred space, an inviolable realm uniquely protected by a lineage of indigenous deities. The state ideologues, primarily high-ranking clerical advisors, argued that the national identity was rooted in a specific spiritual harmony that combined the moral order of continental philosophy with the ritual purity of local traditions. Under this framework, the foreign faith was not merely characterized as a competing set of beliefs, but as a fundamental metaphysical contamination that threatened to degrade the spiritual integrity of the entire population. The administration utilized the language of hygiene and medicine to frame the presence of the mission as a malignant growth within the body politic, necessitating an immediate and absolute surgical removal. This ideological construct relied on the assertion that the indigenous social and religious order was a natural and self-contained system. The foreign doctrine was portrayed as an artificial and corrosive force that sought to dissolve the organic bonds between the people and their ancestral protectors. The state maintained that the introduction of an external salvation narrative disrupted the cosmic balance of the realm, leading to natural disasters, social unrest, and the breakdown of traditional ethics. By framing the expulsion as a necessary act of purification, the government repositioned itself as the supreme guardian of the nation's spiritual health. This allowed the military leadership to justify the most extreme forms of exclusion as a compassionate and defensive measure intended to restore the original, unpolluted state of the islands. The use of this organic metaphor transformed the expulsion from a political dispute into a sacred duty, making the total erasure of the sect a prerequisite for the continued favor of the national deities. Furthermore, the theological argument established a rigid definition of what it meant to be a legitimate subject of the state. Adherence to the traditional syncretic order became the primary marker of national belonging, while the foreign faith was classified as a terminal spiritual pathology. The administration argued that the foreign teaching corrupted the natural intellect of the subjects, rendering them incapable of understanding the inherent moral laws of the land. By characterizing the mission as a contagion, the state justified the use of quarantine-like measures, including the total isolation of the borders and the systematic inspection of every individual's private conscience. This theological framing ensured that the policy of exclusion would be perceived as a permanent and irreversible necessity. It provided the intellectual foundation for a state that defined itself through the total rejection of foreign influence, establishing a precedent where ideological homogeneity was viewed as the ultimate guarantor of national peace and spiritual vitality. The implementation of the 1614 decree transitioned from legal theory to logistical execution through a coordinated national effort to consolidate the targeted population at a single departure point. The central military government designated the southern port city of Nagasaki as the primary terminal for the removal of the foreign religious leadership and the high-ranking native elite. This concentration was a massive administrative undertaking that required the synchronization of local provincial authorities across the archipelago. Every regional governor was issued a strict mandate to identify, apprehend, and transport all foreign clerics and prominent converts within their jurisdiction to the coast. This process was not merely a migration, but a forced assembly under military supervision, intended to ensure that no influential member of the proscribed sect could evade the upcoming deportation. The state utilized a precise classification system to determine who would be included in this initial phase of removal. While the general convert population was subject to local surveillance and mandatory recantation, the leadership, consisting of ordained foreign priests and native warriors of significant rank, was isolated for physical expulsion. These individuals were viewed as the intellectual and organizational catalysts of the movement, and their presence on domestic soil was deemed an unacceptable security risk. The journey to the southern coast involved the liquidation of their remaining personal assets and the final severance of their ties to their ancestral lands. Upon arrival at the port, the exiles were housed in highly regulated facilities, frequently consisting of temporary barracks or converted religious structures that had been stripped of their previous significance. Nagasaki, which had once functioned as a semi-autonomous enclave for the mission, was transformed into a high-security processing center. The military government installed specialized officials to oversee the inventorying of the arrivals, cross-referencing their identities against the national census records compiled in the previous year. This ensured that every individual slated for removal was physically accounted for before the maritime vessels arrived. The concentration of these exiles in a single location allowed the state to monitor their communications and prevent the clandestine dispersal of the clergy into the interior provinces. The atmosphere in the port city during this period was characterized by a profound sense of administrative finality, as the once powerful leaders of the mission were reduced to the status of state prisoners awaiting transit. This logistical consolidation represented the final domestic phase of the expulsion policy, successfully isolating the core of the religious movement from its local support networks and preparing the way for the total severance of the mission from the Japanese state. The execution of the 1614 expulsion decree was accompanied by a systematic campaign to liquidate the physical infrastructure of the foreign faith, ensuring that the movement was deprived of its architectural and educational foundations. This process was not a series of spontaneous riots, but a state-managed operation of demolition intended to erase the visual and institutional presence of the mission from the Japanese landscape. The primary target of this operation was the urban center of Nagasaki, which housed the most significant concentration of religious edifices in the archipelago. The central military government mandated that all places of worship be dismantled immediately, with the labor often provided by the very communities that had previously supported the mission, serving as a forced demonstration of their new allegiance to the state. The centerpiece of this architectural purge was the destruction of the massive cathedral located on the heights of the southern port. This structure, which had served as the spiritual and administrative heart of the mission for decades, was reduced to rubble under the supervision of government inspectors. The demolition involved the systematic removal of all religious icons, liturgical objects, and decorative elements, which were either publicly burned or confiscated for their material value. The state intended for the disappearance of this landmark to symbolize the total reclamation of judicial and spiritual sovereignty over the territory. Beyond the primary churches, the campaign extended to the network of local educational facilities and seminaries that had functioned as the intellectual centers of the movement. These institutions, responsible for the dissemination of Western languages and sciences, were permanently closed, and their libraries either destroyed or absorbed into state-managed archives. The military administration utilized the materials from the dismantled buildings for the construction of secular government offices or the expansion of coastal fortifications, further integrating the physical remnants of the mission into the apparatus of the state. In many instances, the government ordered the construction of Buddhist temples directly upon the foundations of the demolished churches, a practice designed to overwrite the religious geography of the region with state-approved orthodoxy. This policy of architectural erasure ensured that the religious minority possessed no physical space for assembly, forcing any remaining adherents into a state of domestic isolation. By late 1614, the visual landscape of the southern ports had been fundamentally transformed, as the monumental European facades were replaced by traditional structures. This total destruction of assets finalized the institutional collapse of the faith, leaving the converts without the infrastructure required to sustain a communal identity. The implementation of the 1614 expulsion decree was supported by a comprehensive program of financial liquidation designed to permanently dismantle the economic capacity of the proscribed movement. This operation involved the systematic seizure of all landed properties, commercial investments, and liquid capital previously held by the foreign religious organizations and their high-ranking domestic supporters. The central military government justified these confiscations through a legal framework that redefined the mission's assets as the proceeds of subversive activities against the state. By centralizing the management of these resources, the administration ensured that the religious minority was deprived of the material means to sustain its institutional life or fund a potential return to the archipelago. A primary component of this fiscal strategy was the total redirection of international customs revenues and harbor duties to the central treasury. In previous decades, a significant portion of the wealth generated from maritime commerce had been diverted to fund the construction of religious infrastructure and the maintenance of the mission's charitable and educational programs. Following the expulsion, the government installed specialized financial officials to oversee the administration of the southern ports, ensuring that every transaction involving foreign vessels contributed directly to the state's fiscal reserves. This transition eliminated the financial autonomy of the southern regions and consolidated the government's monopoly over the lucrative maritime trade. The state utilized these redirected funds to finance the expansion of its own administrative and military apparatus, turning the previous wealth of the mission into an instrument of national stabilization. Furthermore, the government targeted the mission's extensive portfolio of domestic loans and commercial partnerships. The religious orders had functioned as significant creditors within the Japanese economy, providing capital to regional lords and urban merchant guilds. The central administration moved to terminate these financial contracts, either by calling in the debts for immediate payment into the treasury, or by transferring the interest obligations to state-managed accounts. This move allowed the government to exert direct influence over the financial health of the regional elites, who had previously relied on the mission for credit. The state also confiscated the vast stockpiles of precious metals and refined bullion stored within the religious enclaves, integrating these assets into the national currency system. By the conclusion of 1614, the mission's once vast economic empire had been entirely absorbed by the central government. This total financial excision ensured that the religious movement possessed no residual capital to support a clandestine existence, finalizing the state's control over the material and ideological landscape of the realm. In November 1614, the logistical preparation for the maritime deportation culminated in the mandatory embarkation of the religious and social elite from the southern coastal terminal. This operation involved the forced removal of approximately 300 individuals, consisting of nearly all remaining foreign clerics and a significant cohort of prominent families whose high social standing made their continued presence a domestic security liability. The exiles were divided into two primary groups based on their previous institutional affiliations and the geopolitical jurisdictions of their destinations. One fleet was dispatched toward the administrative center on the South China coast, while a second group was transported to the colonial headquarters in the Philippine archipelago. These destinations were selected because they functioned as the primary logistical hubs for the respective religious orders that had operated within the islands for the preceding 6 decades. The process of embarkation was executed under the rigorous supervision of central government inspectors, who conducted a final verification of the manifest to ensure that no high-value individuals remained concealed on domestic soil. The exiles were prohibited from carrying significant personal wealth or religious artifacts, effectively stripping them of their remaining cultural and material influence before they left the territorial waters. This maritime exodus was not conducted in the advanced European vessels that had characterized the earlier trade era, but largely utilized regional merchant craft that lacked the provisions required for a long-distance voyage. The conditions on these vessels were characterized by extreme overcrowding and a lack of infrastructure, reflecting the state's desire to treat the departure as a punitive measure rather than a standard relocation. Upon the departure of the vessels, the central administration implemented a strict blockade of the southern coastline to prevent any unauthorized return of the exiles. The government issued orders to the coastal defenses to intercept any foreign vessel suspected of harboring religious agents, transitioning the state's policy from active expulsion to permanent exclusion. For the Japanese exiles, many of whom were elderly or had never traveled beyond the archipelago, the deportation represented a total severance of their ancestral ties and the permanent loss of their hereditary status. This mass removal successfully decapitated the organizational structure of the foreign faith, leaving the remaining convert population without the intellectual or clerical leadership required to maintain a visible communal presence. The successful completion of this maritime operation signaled the finality of the 1614 decree, establishing a new demographic reality where the internal security of the realm was maintained through the absolute physical removal of all non-conforming elements from the national territory. The administrative removal of the highest-ranking native military officer of the faith represented the final severance of the religious movement from the domestic warrior elite. This individual, previously a territorial governor with significant holdings in the central provinces, had maintained a persistent refusal to recant his theological commitments, despite the increasing severity of national restrictions. His position within the professional military class was unique. He had participated in major unification campaigns while simultaneously serving as a primary patron for the foreign missions infrastructure. The central government viewed his continued presence as a primary security risk, as his martial expertise and hereditary status provided him with the authority to potentially mobilize a significant faction of the convert population against the state. The 1614 decree facilitated his transition from an internal political dissident to a permanent exile, ensuring that the movement was deprived of its most capable native military leader. The logistical transfer of this prominent leader and his immediate family to the colonial capital of the neighboring archipelago was conducted under strict military supervision to prevent any local interference. Upon his arrival at the foreign headquarters, the European administration received him as a high-value political asset rather than a common refugee. The colonial governors recognized that his intimate knowledge of domestic fortification techniques and regional politics could be utilized to facilitate a future intervention. For the overseas powers, his arrival served as a significant political victory, providing them with a living symbol of the ideological conflict within the islands. However, the state's decision to deport him effectively neutralized his domestic influence by placing him in a distant jurisdiction where he lacked the necessary resources to command a viable military force. The death of this exiled leader shortly after his arrival in the foreign territory served as the definitive conclusion to the era of native leadership within the mission. His passing removed the last high-ranking figurehead who possessed the legitimacy to challenge the supreme commander's monopoly on social and political order. The military government utilized reports of his terminal status to validate the policy of exclusion, framing his death in a foreign land as the natural consequence of abandoning national traditions. For the remaining clandestine adherents, the loss of their most visible advocate finalized their descent into a leaderless and fragmented existence. This individual exile functioned as the final terminal point for the institutionalized faith, marking the total transition toward a society where the military elite was defined by its absolute rejection of foreign spiritual and political influence. By early 1615, the removal of the traditional leadership was complete, ensuring that the state faced no organized internal resistance to the final implementation of the isolationist policy. The mass removal of the foreign missions and their elite supporters in 1614 triggered an immediate and profound administrative crisis within the primary international trade hubs. For decades, the governance of these urban centers had relied on a specialized class of native administrators who possessed the linguistic and technical skills necessary to manage complex maritime logistics. Many of these officials were converts whose professional identities were deeply integrated into the institutional networks of the foreign missions. Their sudden deportation or removal from office created a structural vacuum in the local civil service, leaving the military government without the personnel required to oversee the daily operations of international commerce and urban regulation. The most significant disruption occurred within the commercial guilds that regulated the entry and distribution of foreign commodities. These organizations had developed a sophisticated system for the collective purchase of imported goods, a mechanism designed to prevent price volatility and ensure a stable supply for the domestic market. The leadership of these guilds was predominantly comprised of individuals who had been trained within the educational facilities of the religious missions. Their removal paralyzed the established protocols for quality assessment, credit management, and bulk transaction negotiations. The central government found itself forced to install military officials with no prior experience in international trade to manage these specialized commercial functions, leading to significant delays and fiscal inefficiencies during the initial transition period. The loss of skilled interpreters and legal advisors further complicated the state's efforts to maintain its new secular trade partnerships. These individuals had functioned as the primary diplomatic bridge between the central authorities and the foreign merchant fleets, managing the translation of maritime contracts and the resolution of jurisdictional disputes. Without these experienced intermediaries, the shogunate struggled to communicate its new regulatory requirements to the visiting captains, resulting in increased diplomatic friction and maritime accidents. The administration attempted to fill these roles by recruiting secular scholars and former low-level clerks, but these replacements often lacked the specific technical vocabulary and global awareness required for effective international mediation. Furthermore, the social vacuum extended to the management of public welfare and municipal security. The mission-managed hospitals, orphanages, and housing cooperatives had provided a layer of social stability that the central state was not yet equipped to replace. The sudden closure of these facilities forced the military government to divert significant resources to establish new, state-controlled charitable institutions to prevent urban unrest. By early 1615, the struggle to replace the Christian administrative class had highlighted the deep level of integration the foreign faith had achieved within the Japanese social and economic infrastructure. The state's efforts to overcome this vacuum necessitated the rapid professionalization of a new, religiously orthodox bureaucracy, a process that redefined the relationship between the central government and the commercial urban elite. The departure of the formal religious leadership in 1614 necessitated an immediate and total transition of the remaining convert population into a decentralized and clandestine social structure. With the official clerical hierarchy removed to overseas colonies, The survival of the prohibited sect became the exclusive responsibility of lay organizations that had previously functioned as auxiliary charitable groups. These domestic associations were reorganized into secretive cells, led by individuals who assumed the duties of maintaining the liturgical calendar and preserving the oral transmission of doctrine. This shift represented a fundamental transformation of the faith from a public, institutional presence into a private, domestic tradition that operated entirely outside the visibility of the state's administrative apparatus. To evade the continuous inspections of the mandatory registration system, these underground groups developed sophisticated methods of symbolic camouflage. Religious icons were intentionally modified to resemble the figures and symbols of traditional domestic deities, allowing adherents to maintain their private devotion while appearing to comply with the state-mandated orthodoxy. Sacred texts and prayers were no longer committed to paper, but were preserved through a rigid system of oral recitation, preventing the discovery of incriminating physical evidence during government raids. This reliance on memory over documentation led to a gradual divergence from the original theological standards, as the teachings became increasingly integrated with local cultural themes and linguistic patterns. The geography of the southern islands provided essential refuge for these communities, as many adherents relocated to isolated coastal valleys and remote offshore territories that were beyond the direct daily reach of the central authorities. In these marginalized zones, the underground faith became a hereditary trait, passed down within families through secretive initiation rituals that occurred under the guise of standard domestic activities. The state's inability to monitor every remote village allowed these pockets of resistance to persist as self-contained units, shielded by the complicity of the local populace and the physical barriers of the terrain. The role of the lay leader was redefined to include the administration of basic rites, such as the recording of births and the performance of funeral preparations, which were conducted in secret before the official public ceremonies required by the state. This dual existence created a permanent psychological barrier between the private conscience of the subject and their public persona as a loyal citizen. By late 1615, the transition to a hidden existence was complete, establishing a resilient and invisible network that would survive the state's most rigorous efforts at ideological purification. The movement had successfully retreated into the domestic sphere, ensuring its continuity through a total commitment to absolute secrecy. The 1614 expulsion served as the structural blueprint for a comprehensive grand strategy of national isolation that would define the state for the next 2.5 centuries. While previous measures had focused on the selective removal of religious personnel, the legal and logistical successes of the 1614 operation convinced the central government that a total severance of uncontrolled foreign contact was both achievable and necessary for the long-term survival of the military dynasty. This event marked the transition from a policy of reactive religious persecution to a proactive system of maritime restriction. The administration recognized that the physical removal of foreign agents was only the first stage in a broader program to eliminate all external influences that could potentially challenge the state's monopoly on domestic order and judicial authority. Following the 1614 decree, the military leadership expanded the scope of its prohibitions to include the total regulation of international movement by its own subjects. In the 1630s, the government issued a series of supplementary directives that prohibited any resident from traveling abroad and made the return of overseas Japanese a capital offense. This was a direct extension of the administrative logic established during the expulsion, as the state sought to prevent the reintroduction of prohibited ideologies through the returning merchant and labor classes. The authorities concluded that a closed border was the only effective method for maintaining the ideological purity achieved through the earlier purges. Furthermore, the administration intensified its control over the remaining foreign commercial activities, eventually confining all international exchange to a single, highly regulated artificial island. This allowed the state to extract the benefits of trade while ensuring the total physical and social isolation of the foreign merchants from the domestic population. The 1614 edict also provided the precedent for the total prohibition of foreign literature, creating an intellectual barrier that complemented the physical maritime blockade. The government implemented a rigorous system of book censorship, targeting any material that referenced the outside world or unconventional philosophical concepts. This comprehensive control over the flow of information finalized the transformation of the realm into a managed and secluded political entity. The state's ability to successfully deport the religious elite and dismantle their domestic infrastructure had proven that the archipelago could function as a self-contained unit, independent of the southern European maritime networks. By the mid-17th century, the foundational steps taken during the 1614 expulsion had evolved into a permanent national policy of total isolation, establishing a period of unprecedented domestic stability and administrative continuity. The closure of the borders was the ultimate fulfillment of the 1614 mandate, ensuring that the state remained the sole arbiter of the religious, economic, and political life of its citizens.